Can start whatever. So welcome back to our course on Kant's Doctrine of Virtue. Yesterday we had some ideas, or brought forward some ideas about Kant's concepts of obligation in the groundwork and in before. And you know, obligation expresses a kind of normativity that you are bound by the moral law according to the categorical imperative to act only on a certain kind of maxims, namely those maxims which qualify as general laws. But to act, you need more than a maxim. That is to say, you need a maxim, but in the maxim it's not only expressed on the categorical imperative, not only expressed the source of normativity, but in the maxim there's also some information about the end of your action, of course, because without an end you cannot act. This sometimes is brought forward by Hegel as a critic against the Kantian conception of action, but obviously nobody disclaimed the necessity of having ends to act, otherwise you wouldn't know what to do. So the question, because in the Doctrine of Virtue, the concept of the end becomes very important because Kant believes that there are ends which are at the same time duties. The question is what Kant is talking about or saying about the concept of end in the groundwork. And let's have a look at some of the quotations. I ended with this PowerPoint presentation a couple of days ago, but maybe I can't remember. So I will read them. The will is thought, he says, as a capacity to determine itself to acting in conformity with the representation of certain laws. Representation in German means Vorstellung, and Vorstellung, representation can mean many things. It can mean some intuition, it can mean a concept of the understanding, it can mean the idea, so everything which is in your mind, so to speak, either which is an intuition or which is conceptually, which is a concept, can be called of to be a representation. And here it's meant the representation of certain laws, that is of maxims, which qualify of being necessary. And this determination of the will is quite common in German philosophy at the time. You find something similar involved, and as being acquainted with Wolfian philosophy, being a student of Kant maybe, and you read that, you know that Kant is here not saying something unusual. This is, so to speak, standard conviction. Okay. And such a capacity can be found only in rational beings. That's fine. So rationality means to be able to act on the representation of rules or maybe laws. He's not saying here that these rules or laws have something to do with morality. So even if human beings would have no pure reason but only understanding, it might be possible to claim that their will has a capacity to act on the representations of laws, namely the laws of nature, you see. So this is quite indifferent between natural laws and laws of freedom. Okay. Now what serves the will as the objective ground of its self-determination is an end. And this, if it is given by reason alone, must hold equally for all rational beings. So the idea is, reason is the capacity to give you an end on which you can act if you want to according to the will. What, on the other hand, contains merely the ground of the possibility of an action, the effect of which is an end, is called a means. So you have two different ideas. You have the idea that reason can represent to you an end, and reason can present to you the means which make it possible to reach the end. This we will later call hypothetical imperative.
Sorry, a question. One representation is always a theoretical representation, or
it's what means theoretical? It's representation means it's in your consciousness, so to speak, that you have a grasp of it. It has nothing to do with the distinction between theoretical and practical philosophy. It is something which is in your mind, so to speak. And it has a practical power, this representation, if it is regarded to be the ground for your action. So something theoretical, to take up this expression, can become practical if the theoretical representation becomes of importance to you, if you take an interest in it. So you can say, you can look outside and find somebody you know and you want to meet him. And if you want to meet, you can see a person out there. This is some theoretical stuff. And if you take an interest in this person, then maybe you decide to go outside and welcome him. So the first one is you have a representation. That means you have a concept of what's going on there. And then this concept of what's going on there might become practical because you take an interest in him. And taking interest in him can have two different sources, so to speak, as we will see in the introduction to the metaphysics of knowledge, because it differentiates between two different types of interests. The one interest rests or has its foundation in your sensibility. You like to meet this person just because you know you have an inclination to him or her. This is something about your sensibility, you are driven to go and so on and so forth. Or the other one is an interest of reason, in terms of practical reason. So reason tells you, as Kant would argue in the Doctrine of Virtue, that you should take and that you do take as a practical interest in the well-being of other people, not being founded on your inclination, but founded in your pure reason, because pure reason tells you that you have the obligation to promote the happiness of other people. So doing the same thing, promoting the well-being of other people, might have its root in two different kinds of interests. The one is you do something good because you love this person. The other one is you don't care about that person in terms of feeling and inclination and so on and so forth. Maybe you hate this person, but then you see that this person needs your help because he had an accident or whatever, and then your pure reason says, ah, come on, I'm obliged to promote and so on. Then your help in distress and so on and so forth. There's two different kinds of interest. This is very important because if you would only have an empirical interest, which is founded on your inclinations and so on and so forth, you will never pure reason getting started. So the idea is without this pure reason driving you to take an interest in the freedom, that's the point, in the freedom and autonomy of other people, then you could say, oh, there's a person in distress, bad luck to her, because I don't like her. You would say, oh, come on, this is the brother of Hitler or something like that. Oh, that's a new Hitler. Imagine you were driving don't mention you were driving on the German Autobahn in 1935 and you see that the guy had an accident. And you go there and you find Himmler, Göring, and Hitler in the car being severely hurted by the car accident. So what to do? Maybe you're a Jew or you're a communist or just a liberal and you know what will happen in maybe in a couple of years' time. So what will you do? You say, come on, good occasion that this guy will die.
Let them die.
Maybe let them die. So whatever, maybe Kant would say, come on, still human beings. I don't know. That's a matter of casuistics. Maybe. So whatever. The main distinction here you see between being an action being mean to something which you take an interest in. Also Kant doesn't introduce at this point the concept of interest. And he, in the Doctrine of Virtue, he starts with the concept of desire, Begierungsvermögen. Desire means the basic impulse, motivation ground, capacity to act on representations. That's a basic one. Everybody has that. Even maybe subjects without pure practical reason. Without desire, Begehrungsvermögen, you wouldn't be able to act. You would just be driven by instinct or whatever.
Professor, here's a question. But the desire must be aligned with the categorical imperative, because as you just gave the example right now, if we find Bolsonaro and Hitler on the car and they are injured, we will not have this desire to help them, even though we know that in a practical reason we should do this. So how does spheres relate each other? Like this?
I mean, it's a complicated story. Maybe we will discuss it in more detail reading the introduction to the metaphysics of mind. So there he introduces, so to speak, he climbs the hill. He starts with the basic concepts, the basic competitions of human beings, and the basic one is desire. And having desire means having the ability to reach something you want to reach just because you decided to reach it, something. And desire here comes with inclination, because desire, which has a duration in time, becomes inclination. And inclination in Kant always comes with some minimal form of rationality. Animals do not have inclinations. They are driven by instincts. Inclinations mean that you have a reflected conception of what's going on in you, being just a natural human being, so to speak. It's not about pure practical reason. And pure practical, so therefore Kant always talks in the groundwork about inclinations, because inclinations means the starting point of what it means to be minimalistically rational, so to speak. So the birds outside there don't have inclinations, they're instincts. They cannot be corrected through deliberations. And deliberations meaning you have an idea about the relation between means and ends. The animals don't have that, according to Kant. Maybe some dogs have it. According to Kant, they don't have it. They're just driven by instinct. So this is the starting point, and everybody would agree with that, I would say, in the 18th century before Kant. So that's not the problem. The problem comes in whether there is some higher form of rationality, which makes you able to reflect on your inclinations and on the maxims connected with inclinations. Because inclinations mean something general, and maxims are the conceptual representations of your inclinations. So inclinations always come with rules. This is minimal standard of rationality. And then there's a higher form of rationality called pure practical reason. And pure practical reason means in Kant that you have some specific sorts of concepts with which you can decide whether or not these rules connected to inclinations fit to become a law or not. A law of what? Of freedom. Maxims are, so to speak, as such forms of nature. They belong to some kind of nature. So if you want to have a naturalistic conception of rationality or normativity in Kant, you have the duty to show that pure practical reason is a version of a naturalistic conception of reason in general. That might be a hard stuff to do. But that's it, so to speak. Kant would say you can do natural philosophy and have a naturalistic conception of the small written reason, so not with a capital R, so to speak, but with a small R at the beginning of reason, without doing metaphysics. That would be Hume. Think about David Hume. Hume would be the person who says, here are desires, and make there rules in Hume as well. There are standards of taste, for instance, and standards of morality, and they grow up this standard in communicating, in refining our sensibility, in refining our tastes of morals and of aesthetics and so on and so forth. And this is all about nature. And he always claims that what's true about human beings might also be true about animals. He says, I prove that my theory is true in referring to the animals in the treatise of human beings. Animals maybe are not so refined taste, they don't go into exhibitions and look at pictures and so on and so forth, but on the level of actions and making representations and having a correct picture of nature, in principle the same as human beings. But Kant would disclaim that. He would say, no, there's something else and so on and so forth. And here he introduces a conception of will, which shall make clear that there's a difference between ends and means, and that there are different types of say, motives. And here in English, it's distinguished between motives and incentives. So read the sentence. The subjective ground of desire is an incentive, Triebfeder. The objective ground of volition is a motive. Hence the distinction between subjective ends, which rest on incentives, and objective ends, which depend on motives, which hold for every rational being. So here he seems, it's not quite clear the sentence. He seems to say, okay, subjective, everything is, the subjective ground is incentive, Triebfeder, like in a watch, and objective ground is motive. That sounds a little bit strange because this is not German, so to speak. Incentive, it's fine, but incentives are, in modern English language, motives, of course.
Yeah.
Incentives are motives because they motivate you. But you can't, at this point, says, well, there's a difference and so on. And it sounds a little bit strange. Anyway, he says two different, merely subjective and objective. And most of the time in his other writings, he doesn't make this distinction. He talks about Bewegungsgrund, the reason or the ground which moves you. And it could be just sensible or could be rational. Okay, and then he says practical principles are formal if they abstract from all subjective ends, whereas they are material if they have put these and consequently certain incentives at their basis. The ends that a rational being proposes at this discretion are effects of his actions, materials, ends, and are relative. So here he introduces his found of that distinction between form and material. This was introduced in scholastic philosophy and nothing new and so on and so forth. So the idea is the content of your willing is the material. The content. And the content, he claims here, stems from sensibility. So every end you are looking for to realize through your action stems from your sensibility, that is to say, it seems to be an incentive, something like that. But then he also claims that there is a form, and this form abstracts from all subjective ends. And in morality, he claims it's all about the form. So if you look on the maxim, you have a content. He says it's material, so to speak. And the content is all about the end. And if you want to know whether or not the maxim qualifies as a general law, then you do not regard the content of the maxim, but the form of the maxim, whatever that means. So it seems to be, say, you have something like this, a bottle or whatever, and then you find something which is in your maxim. This is your maxim, and you're looking for this maxim, and this is the end of your maxim. And it qualifies as being an end of your maxim perfectly, and now comes the form of rationality, and then you look if this content of the maxim goes into this bottle, into this, maybe it was strange. What this means is really hard to understand, but what is easy to understand is that in looking onto the maxim from the perspective of pure practical reason doesn't mean at the first place to look at the end, but to look at the form. But the form always comes with the end, of course. But what is important here as well is that he claims that all ends seem to come from sensibility, although he says there's an objective motive as well. And in the doctrine of virtue, he will say something different. He will say, reason itself gives you some ends which follow directly from pure reason. And we will see that in the next step of the argumentation, in the next slice or the slice after the next one, he introduces an end which is material, although it doesn't come from sensibility, but comes from rationality. Let's have a look. You can write a book about this. But suppose, so this was the picture he gave at third place, and now comes the next paragraph, and he says, but suppose there was something, the existence of which in itself has an absolute worth. Wert. Something which is an end in itself could be the ground of determinate laws, then in it, and in it alone, would lie the ground of a possible categorical imperative, that is, of a practical law. Now I say that the human being, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in itself, not merely as a means to be used by this or that will as its discretion. Instead, he must in all actions, whether with E, directed to himself or also to other rational beings, always be regarded at the same time as an end. Now comes a new idea in the Doctrine. It says, there are some ends, namely those ends which stem from your sensibility, which are not realized, because you have a representation of this end, but you want these ends to be real, to be existing. And you have to do something for these ends being real in the world. You have to act. So if you want something to happen outside, you have to go outside. You have to do something. And now he introduces the idea of an end which already is there, which already exists. And because this end, which is already there, which has reality, has an absolute worth, this becomes the condition under which you are allowed to promote those ends which are not still existing. So to put it in another way, here are your subjective ends resting on desires, and you have incentives. You want to do something, you want to kill your neighbor because you hate your neighbor. And then you are thinking about you are thinking about what has worth in the world, and then you realize that something already existed as an end in itself, namely your neighbor being a purely rational being and having freedom and so on and so forth. And therefore you realize that your subjective end cannot be a motive for your action just because it's not allowed, because the person existed as an end in itself you wanted to kill. You see? So there are two types of ends. Ends which you want to promote because you have a desire to it, and another end which already exists and which is, so to speak, the normative standard which decides whether or not you are allowed to promote your subjective ends or not. That's the idea. And he refers to this with the concept of absolute worth. Sometimes people believe that Kant is somehow like a value theorist because he believes that there in the intelligible world are existing values, or one big value called humanity, because it's the idea of humanity existing in itself. That's not quite true, just because worth means that you appreciate something. If something is to you has some worth to you, then you appreciate it. And appreciating means that you will choose to take it. If you have the chance to choose between three different things, and you choose above all green books, then you will ever choose the green book about all other books. And the idea of Kant is that you as pure rational being always, because you are pure rational being, choose the green book. And the green book is rationality, freedom, autonomy. So as a pure rational being, you choose yourself, so to speak. You choose the conditions under which you as a rational being and all other rational beings can exist as rational beings. And this is an expression he tries to make more understandable through the concept of this interest which rests on pure reason. So you as a rational being take an interest in rationality being existing in the world. So you, because you yourself value your humanity, you value the humanity of everybody. And that's a matter of fact. That is not something which you can construct as you find it in Kostka. Kostka says, well, you can give an argument why you should value yourself as, why you should value your humanity and why you should value the humanity of other people, because if you don't do that, you cannot value your particular identity. So the idea in Kostka is to say, because you value yourself to be Brazilian or a woman or a member of the Communist Party or a follower of Lula or whatever, you can only value your particular identities in valuing your humanity. That's the idea. So it's something like a transcendental argument, a conditional thought. If you value your being female, then you have to value something in you which goes beyond that, something like that. And therefore, Kant gives you an argument, or tries to give you an argument. But Kant doesn't argue that way. He would say, the starting point is not that you value something which is particular about yourself, being Brazilian or German or Italian or whatever, but the starting point is that you value something general in you, that you value your autonomy, that you value being the cause of your actions. And in doing so, you value something which is common to everybody who partakes in this kind of rationality. Therefore, Kant, I would claim, is not a constructivist at this point. He's more like a, well, realist isn't maybe a proper term itself, because it comes from different fields of discussion, so to speak. But he says, this is the starting point. If you do not accept that something has absolute worth, and you do not take an interest in your rationality, there will be no way to make you convinced of that. There's no way of convincing, say, Hitler to value himself as an autonomous being, which implies valuing himself as somebody who is on equal terms with every other human being. Hitler would say, I'm not on the same level with the Jews, or with the people from other countries which are from different origins, races, and so on. And Kant would say, Hitler, come on, let's think about it. Become sober. You remember Spinoza yesterday? So Kant was saying against Spinoza, Spinoza, you think you are an atheist, but actually think again. Then you will realize that your atheism doesn't work. So he would say to Hitler, either you are crazy, then you are beyond rationality, and Kant claims that people can be so, just because you are not in the power of making use of your freedom. If you get drunk and so on, or have some illness, then you are not in the power of freedom. So people can look like being in the position of having the power of making use of the freedom. They look like us, but you see there's something going wrong. But in general, Kant is so to speak, is a cosmopolitan thinker, and he's a philosopher of equality. And he says everybody takes part in that, and you always have to address the other person as having the ability to take part in this community of freedom valuing persons.
Heiner, can you say, if you take it as a point of start, that this is a postulate of the rationality of the reason?
Yeah, it's postulate. He uses this concept of postulate, I think, in the second section of the groundwork. And there he says, well, I introduce the idea that human beings as rational beings exist as in themselves as a postulate, but I will show in the third section of the groundwork the reasons for it, so to speak. And what does he, and there's, you know, this third section of the groundwork, it's a mess in terms of interpretation, because if you ask three Kantians what interpretation is a good one, then you find 4 answers, or maybe 5, I don't know. So it's highly complicated. But actually, I would say, and then he raises the question, how is the categorical imperative possible? And the categorical imperative is only possible if, as he says here, in the second section, something exists with having objective value. But in the third section, I claim some people say he's a value theorist. But actually in the third section, the concept of value and absolute worth and dignity doesn't appear at all. So there must be an answer to the question how the categorical imperative is possible without making reference to dignity and absolute worth and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that it has no importance for Kant. Of course it does have. See the second specific formula of the concept. But the argument runs a different way. And the argument seems to be that it is shown that we have this, that we exist, so to speak, as entities themselves, because he says everybody regards himself to act under the idea of freedom. So it's the idea of freedom who is a clue to the answer why the categorical imperative works. He says, if human beings are beings who regard themselves to be free, then all this follows, because freedom makes you a member not of the naturalistic world only, but also of a world in which other kinds of concepts apply to determining your will. There are some, now I haven't the English version with me. He says, for instance, this is my proper self. My proper self is my will. My proper self is the will under the moral law, so to speak. I regard myself to be by my own, so to speak, with my own, in acting on principles which have their origin in my rationality. And he says, although I cannot prove the idea of freedom, I'm allowed to make use of this freedom because of what? Because in the first critique, I have shown in the dialectic that it is impossible to disprove that freedom is real. Third antinomy. The object of the third antinomy is not to prove that freedom is objective, because it isn't. There's no way to prove in theoretical ways the objective reality of freedom, but because the critique of pure reason as against Schulz, for instance, shows that it is impossible to disprove the idea, the reality, the practical reality of the idea of freedom by means of theoretical philosophy. Therefore, in a practical sense, I can make use of it. I'm on safe ground, so to speak, in doing so. So I have to do something to prove myself to be a pure rational being. I have to do something. It sounds a little bit like Fichte. It's not a metaphysical. This claim to be free is so performative. I act on this idea. I know I shouldn't kill this person. I want to kill him. But then I'm reflecting and make use of this general principle, and then I realize I shouldn't. And it has an effect. I see from my perspective that looking on the principles of pure rationality has a practical effect on my action, although from a naturalistic point of view, my action can be explained by my desires, whatever, and so on and so forth. So for the same action, you have 2 different kinds of explanations. You can make reference to the causality of nature. You can go to a clinic or to the psychologist or whatever, and they explain why you do that, or didn't do that, or will do that. or you can go to the philosophy department and then you read Kant and you say, oh yes, I did it just because I value myself as a rational being, and valuing myself means valuing everybody, and so on and so forth. And he claims that everybody of us makes a difference between actions which are caused by ourselves and actions which are not caused by ourselves. If you go to court, you say, I didn't do that. Or maybe my body did it, but I didn't do it. I was driven, I was part of nature, there were drugs or people forced me to do. And in other cases you say, yes, I did it because I thought it was right, because I was acting and so on and so forth. And this practical claim, so to speak, makes us regard ourselves as beings which have a special status in this world. And this special status can never ever be explained just in terms of psychology, physics, biology, and so on and so on. And that's the argument of the problem. And there are many people who are criticizing Kant's groundwork idea because they think the second critique is much better because of this fact of practical reason, consciousness of practical reason. I'm not sure about it. Actually, there are, I would say, two versions of one and the same basic idea, but that's not our problem here.
I want to know how do you think about the way of we are conscious about our freedom. It's not discursive consciousness, but is no intuitive, but have something like an immediately.
Yeah, the idea is how in what way do I become conscious of my freedom? Kant would say, first we start with maxims, and maxims are designed to solve our daily life problems, so to speak. They have nothing to do, at first, with morality. They are, so to speak, organizing our long-term convictions about what is good and bad for us. It's about happiness, so to speak, how we would like to live. And then we realize that there is a perspective on these maxims which do not fit well in a naturalistic, say, picture of the world. You realize that there is a standard of normativity which comes from a perspective you cannot see, smell, and has no direct relation to desires, but must have its origin in concepts which are so general, like the general concept of nature. But they refer to different kinds of causality because it implies the idea that you yourself are the cause. It's about you being an intelligible being, so to speak. So it becomes conscious to you that you are free in terms of autonomy in that moment in which you reflect about the formality of your maxim. If you for the first time ask yourself, oh, this is my maxim, and maybe that's a maxim of my family, and maybe that's a maxim of my tribe and my beloved ones, or that's a maxim of this group and that group. And then you ask the question, but does this maxim be, so to speak, can this maxim be regarded being good from the perspective of every, not only human but rational being? Then you realize there's something in you which is special, so to speak. And there's something in you which is what you value most, he would claim. And if you look into the lectures on anthropology, Kant really makes a lot of it. You know, the lectures were students that were 16 years, 17 years, and he was saying, well, what is important in life? What's important in life? There's one quotation, he said, is it important in life to have good meals? Yeah, it is to some extent. Have fancy cars, but carriages, whatever, traveling and seeing the world. Is that important? Yeah, to some extent it's important. But above all, he says, it's important to live a life in conformity with the moral law. That if you go in the evening to bed, you can say, okay, I did the right thing, so to speak. At the end of all days, you can say, I did the right thing, although I didn't have the best meals I could have. Something like that. Because the meals I had wasn't meals I stole from somebody else, for instance. So something like that. So the dignity being in conformity with yourself. And yourself means with your rationality and so on, and autonomy is what matters, you would say.
Professor. Sorry, please.
Would you not say that it's something like to realize identity with yourself?
Yes, yeah. It's a self-relation. That's my idea. You know, there are different types of moral theory, and one, for instance, which is very popular, is starting moral philosophy from the perspective of the other. Heiner, Frankfurt School, Heiner, maybe. They say, well, you are in a room and then the room opens and somebody comes in and you realize, wow, he needs my help and so on and so forth, like Levinas. So you see he's in distress and so on and so forth. So you are put under obligation by somebody else. Without the other, there wouldn't be moral obligations. So something like that. But in Kant, it's not about the other at first place, because you wouldn't take an interest in the distress of the other if you wouldn't realize that the distress of the other is morally relevant. And you can only recognize that the distress of the other is morally relevant if you have access to the moral point of view. And the moral point of view is only be accessible by you in terms of a self-relation. You as a human being stand to something which is transcending your particular individuality. And this is your rationality. So without recognizing that you stand to yourself in a certain normative relationship, expressed by Kant through the concept of obligation, because a moral law obliges you to do something and so on, you wouldn't recognize the other one as being a human being who has rights against you. So the other one obliges me, so to speak, if he comes in, because then I see he needs my help. But this is more like an instantiation of some obligation which just exists because you stand in a certain normative relationship to yourself. And this is, there's Habermas much criticism of value of Kant, of course, but also criticism of Kant. And one of the main criticisms of Habermas against Kant is that Kant misses the field of intersubjectivity, because every moral norm has to be put on the floor and then we have to discuss it and then we bring in our desires and interests and so on and so forth, and then we will decide who has which rights and duties or whatever. It doesn't work according to Kant because it presupposes that you recognize yourself as the other one before as being a person, as having rights and so on and so forth. And Habermas didn't like that idea, but he actually, I would say, has no arguments against it. You know, Karl Otto Apel, the other old Frankfurt, died last year or 2 years ago, was very old, and he wanted to do something which, according to him, was more Kantian. He said, well, there are final justifications of certain rules of morality which cannot be changed in discussing about them. For instance, the status of a person. That I'm a person with rights and duties cannot be the object of our discussion, because it's a presupposition to do discussing what is important for us or not. And Habermas said, no, everything can be put on the floor. Everything can be discussed. But actually, of course, it cannot, because I cannot make it probable that you say, oh, well, in the end, our interests are so strong that your interests do not count. And that's what Habermas claims himself. He said, every interest counts. Everyone, every subject. And if this is true, then this even cannot be so. Because something is, so to speak, beyond measure, namely you as a person. I don't know what your question was. Was it an answer to the question somebody had? Was it? Yes, certainly. I mean, you know, we are here on a very abstract level. Very abstract level. And later not later, but if you look in his anthropology lectures or maybe in his political works, use intersubjectivity and communication and the public comes in as a field in which you and we have to make up our mind about what is really morally and juridically speaking important for us. And if you read the introduction, the preface, not the introduction, the preface to the metaphysics of morals, he says about the doctrine of right, you know, these are only metaphysically first principles of the doctrine of right and also of the doctrine of virtue. It's not the whole system, just because presenting the whole system of the metaphysics of morals is so hard just because we are still discussing things. Things are changing. They are empirical. I mean, the metaphysics of morals is about empirical stuff and the normativity connected to this empirical stuff. And because we didn't have made up our minds about, say, some juridical questions, I cannot, as a philosopher, make a decision. No, we have to discuss it. You know, there was this, in Prussia, for instance, the legal system changed in the 1790s. It was introduced, the so-called the English Landrecht, allgemeines preußisches Landrecht, so the game of, the rules of the game changed and the Prussians want to make the country run more proficient and so on and so forth. But there were many things still under debate and so on and so forth. And Kant said, I as a philosopher cannot deduce empirical content. So this is totally different maybe from Fichte. Fichte believed he could deduce concrete empirical norms, so to speak, from whatever, you know. But Kant said, no, we have to be open.
But it started the same.
Yeah, it started the same, maybe. Yeah.
Identity with
of course.
myself.
Yeah. It's about the self-relation. But the difference to Fichte in general is that Fichte, so to speak, doesn't start with a dualism. And Kant starts with a dualism. He starts in the Critique of Pure Reason with a transcendental aesthetic. So he says there's something which doesn't come from us, which is something which is given to us, and we will never ever know why this is so given to us and why we are affected by it. It's a pure fact, so to speak. And then our rationality comes in terms of form of intuition and form of judging and so on and so forth. And then, so to speak, we make the world run for us. So how it works. But the idea of the groundwork that, so to speak, you prove yourself free in doing something. There seems to be an idea Fichte might have liked very much. And, yeah, but it has metaphysical implications. And guys like Habermas or maybe some modern people wouldn't like that because this is metaphysical stuff. And maybe Ellison wouldn't like that. So, but if you read, I haven't read everything he published because of eye reasons and printed. So his commentary on the groundwork is very small letters, and getting confused about the letter. But if you have the chance to read his fantastic book about the groundwork, of course, then think about or pay attention to what he's saying about obligation and how he tries to explain it. And if obligation gets running, according to his interpretation, without making a metaphysical distinction between the world we live in and the intelligible world. The obligation, if it just explained from, say, two different standpoints of descriptions, doesn't seem really to make the thing running in time. You can claim, of course, and Ellison sometimes does that, he says, well, that sounds like a metaphysical comprehension of freedom, autonomy, obligation, whatever, but that doesn't seem to be sound, and therefore we can give a different interpretation. You can do that, of course, but as a Kant interpretation, and that makes me it's maybe reasonable, but as a Kant interpretation, I think it's not that convincing. But it makes it hard to, maybe not hard, but it's a good work for the future to transform this kind of self-relation into, say, some modern version which people outside philosophy departments may like or whatever. Then maybe you go to the two-standpoint position. So what was the question? In this case, what is the answer?
Yeah, it's related with your question. Can't we say that we have consciousness of our freedom as a properly basic belief or some kind of thing like this? Like a phenomenological belief, something that we just believe without being inferential.
Yeah, you know what I mean. Belief isn't a word Kant would use in this respect, because belief he has this distinction in the first critique, or is this Glauben, Wissen, Meinen, belief, knowledge, taking to be true, something like that. And he wouldn't introduce the concept of belief here. I mean, belief doesn't just mean religious belief, but belief in terms of, it could be the case, but it could be also be otherwise. And in this term, he wouldn't use it, he would use practical knowledge, it's the answer. Practical knowledge. So for us, it's practical knowledge, and this knowledge is, so to speak, realized in acting on these concepts. It's not belief. It's too weak. It's not appropriate to what freedom means to us. You do not believe to be free, but you act as if you were free. And there is no argument you would accept as being a counter-argument against the practical idea of freedom, just because you did what? You read the Critique of Pure Reason, in which it is shown that it's impossible to prove the idea of freedom to be an illusion. So materialism cannot be right. And there's a review of a guy who tried to prove that freedom is impossible. He's called Schulz. And Kant wrote this review in 1783. And there you find some of the arguments against it. He says, well, Schulz claims to have proven that we are not free, but it's impossible. I have shown that this is impossible. And he refers to the importance of the first critique for the second critique and the groundwork, for the groundwork at the end of the groundwork in the fourth subsection. Of the fourth subsection of the groundwork. Unfortunately, I didn't took it with me right now. I had it yesterday, but today I skipped it. Every human being regards himself to act on the idea of freedom. Everybody thinks he's free. Not in every respect, but sometimes, it makes a difference to do that. But it's freedom always connected with morality. It's not the freedom to choose bananas or some other fruits. This is part of your desire story, so to speak. So this particular kind of freedom always comes in with morality. Other
it's a little different question. There is a very accelerated discussion about the character of the nature of the concept of dignity as an absolute verb. This discussion can be very well illustrated by the Oliver Sanson's book. Yes, my question is, it would be the concept of the dignity as an absolute verb, a normative concept, is a very difficult matter.
But the story about Oliver Sanson, there's I think last year or this year, I can't remember, he published his dissertation in Kant many people read that, was Kant on human dignity, and we had some symposium on it with several people discussing it. Actually, also I've written about that, I don't see his point actually. He believes, so what he wants to do is to say Kant is not a value theorist, I agree with that. Value is just of a social nature, something like that. It's the ancient idea you find in Cicerone, Diophikus and other writing, that people have more or less values than other, and so on and so forth and so forth. And that value is, so to speak, created in the way that if people follow the categorical imperatives, then they have more value than not following, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. I mean, what I said, dignity in the third section of the groundwork is not the basic concept of explaining the obligatory force of the categorical imperative. But you still can use this concept, of course. Just because as a rational subject, you regard yourself and other people as having dignity. And dignity is not just socially, so to speak, introduced, but it means that having a chance between choosing between different things, you always, from a normative perspective, choose the perspective of autonomy. That is to say, as a rational being, you do not value desires more than the interests of reason. I don't know what it was. I mean, I don't know, was it an answer to what you were?
No. All right.
Of course, I mean, he has this, he introduces the dignity concept in this second section of the talk. And it is connected with the second, however you count it, second or third version of the categorical imperative. It's about humanity. That you value your humanity, act as if, that you never act against the concept of humanity in you, and so on and so forth. And this then he refers to as the concept of dignity. That's fine. Other?، Sorry?
No way.
Okay, we will never end. Kant will never end. Never-ending seminar. It is rational nature exists as an end in itself. And it is so far as it exists as an end in itself, you can say that every human being has dignity. Because it exists as an end in itself. And in the Doctrine of Virtue, I will say you have to distinguish between two levels. The first level is that you yourself, as a pure rational being, have this dignity. That is to say, nobody ever has good ground or good reason to treat you as a mere end. That's the idea. So on the one side, you yourself exist as an end in itself and as dignity, but because you make more or less moral use of your freedom as a human being, you can have more or less dignity. That's right with Sensen, so to speak. You can have more. The bad Hitler has less dignity, of course, than say Bartleby or whatever. Maybe Bartleby hasn't. Whoever. So there are differences. But whatever bad things a human person does, this person never loses total dignity, because he can never lose its status being a member of the intelligible world. And this distinguishes, whatever that means, this distinguishes the Kantian conception from Christian Wolff, because Wolff claims if you are really a bad guy, then you can be treated as a thing. You can be tortured, you can be killed, you can be critical, but you can be tortured and so on and so forth. You can be treated like a street dog. So, not conception of today's street dog, 17th century, 18th century. You have no value, you can kill them, you can harm them. This is with human beings who are bad. And Kant says, no, there is There's a border, there's a boundary of treating human beings. You have always to treat them in a way that they can improve themselves from their own willing. They still stay to be a human being. So the human being necessarily represents his own existence in this way. The human being necessarily represents his own existence in this way. Because it is, he represents it to be. But later on he will qualify that in ways of that there is no theoretical certainty about that, of course. It's a practical certainty. But every other rational being also represents its existence in this way, consequent on just the same rational grounds, it also holds for me. Thus it is at the same time an objective principle from which, as a supreme practical ground, it must be possible to derive all laws of the will. So all laws of the will are derived from the idea that human beings exist as ends in themselves. So there's an end which qualifies as a norm of promoting subjective ends, but not directly, but through maxims. So your subjective ends become part of your maxims, and the maxims will be looked at from the perspective of the moral law, because the moral law is all about human beings existing as ends in themselves because of their rationality and freedom and autonomy. The principle of humanity and in general of every rational nature as an end in itself is not borrowed from experience. And this end in itself is the... Who did it? No, I didn't. Yes, I did it. Which is the supreme limiting condition of the freedom of action of every human being. So here you have the idea you know about freedom must be limited to sustain itself. Freedom without the law is anarchy. You need to have some bounds of using freedom. The bounds of making use of your freedom are described in terms of every rational being existing as an entity. That's the idea. Rational nature is distinguished from the rest of nature by this, that it sets itself an end. In German, this is a complicated sentence because you do not know exactly what the references are. He says, in the English translation, it was rational nature is distinct from the rest of nature, from the rest of nature. We are nature too, of course, but not only. And nature in German has two meanings. It can be nature as you know, animals, birds, and my headache and my back and so on. But nature also means essence, essentia. And sometimes people in giving the interpretation don't realize that sometimes Kant talking about nature means essentia. It's the essence of rationality. It will give you some examples. So rational nature, in nature here means your intelligible nature. Is distinct from the rest of nature by this, that it, who is this it, rational nature, sets itself an end. So does it mean that rational nature sets itself an end, or does it mean that rational nature sets itself as an end to the rest of nature? It's complicated because grammatically speaking both are possible. This end would be the matter of every goodwill. That seems to be that Kant is saying, what is the matter of every goodwill? That I myself set me as an end for the willing of the goodwill. Sounds like I set myself. Ich setze mich als ein. But since in the idea of a will absolutely good without any limiting condition, abstraction must be made altogether from every end to be affected. Abstraction doesn't mean that you do not, that these ends which come from your sensibility have no effect of your willing, but you have to abstract from them. The end must here be thought not as an end to be affected, but as an immediately existing end, and hence thought only negatively, that is, as that which must never be acted against and which must therefore in every volition be estimated never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end. I think that were 3 sentences. This was 1 sentence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In German, you know, you can make sentences which will never end. And the good news for us is that in the critic of judgment, his sentences are even longer. my guess is that in the critic of judgment you find the highest